Welcome to the program. This is Head to Head, and my name is Alexander Kerry. The war in eastern Ukraine has left more than 10,000 people dead since its beginning in 2014. This conflict deeply transformed the country and the men fighting for it. 33 leading photojournalists from Ukraine, US, Russia and Belarus joined forces to document the events following the Euromaidan revolution. Hours of painstaking work and hundreds of photographs later, we've been presented with this book. So what kind of role do these photographs play in European modern history? Joining us in the studio to discuss the work is the editor of the book, Canadian photojournalist and two-time winner of the World Press Photo Award, Donald Weber. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Weber.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
So first, where did the idea of the book come from? Where did the idea of the book and the exhibition comes from? And so I understand it's part of the bigger project. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, the idea of the book came from three friends of mine who have a small collective, Vanya and Kostya Chernichkin and Anya Voitenko, who are three photographers in Kiev. And it was their initial idea, and it was their initial sort of proposition to me to come on board as a sort of external voice, not necessarily objective, but not being Ukrainian, but understanding the situation in Ukraine after living there for a number of years is what and why they decided to have me become a part of the project.
There are some captivating photographs. For example, the iconic image of the servicemen carrying this red flag during Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. Can you tell us the story behind this photo?
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I ended up going with this picture, that this was, to me, the sort of the divide between Russia and Ukraine, and that this is the moment where everything changed for the country. It's my understanding that it's actually the commanding officer of one of the Ukrainian military bases in Crimea who was basically effectively giving over the keys to the base to Putin's little green men.
And one of the images which I was struck by was this of a little boy hiding in a shell-out building, hiding behind an armchair. This is a very strong image of the war in eastern Ukraine. So why is it so important to convey strong message like that?
Well, I think we also have to realize that war has consequences, not just political consequences, but absolute terrifying and horrific consequences for the people who are caught in between the two sides, the civilians, essentially. And even though the Ukrainian army has sort of struggled and become a resistant force to what's happening in the east, I think it's also dangerous if we choose to neglect or forget the civilian casualties that have been inflicted in this battle.
And there's also an image depicting, speaking of casualties, depicting a soldier sleeping in a dug hole in the ground. Some would argue it looks like a grave. What's the story behind that? What kind of message does it send?
Well, that's the power of photography, is that you can have so many different variations and meanings in a photograph, that it can be the literal interpretation of a soldier sleeping within a dugout, but you can also read it as a soldier digging his own grave. And that, to me, is also the power of photography, because we start seeing, again, the consequences of war, that things happen and terrible things can happen. And maybe this soldier will live, but maybe he'll also die.
You were there for the Orange Revolution in 2004 and for the Euromaidan Revolution. As a photojournalist, how do you see the differences between those events?
Well, massive difference. I think Orange Revolution was a much more politically savvy and organized event. I mean, of course, it still had its grassroots in people rising up against corruption and such under Yanukovych and his regime and the oligarchs. But I also saw it as a very sophisticated revolution that was made for television. But Euromaidan was a true sort of reflection of the people rising and saying enough, that this was not coming from any kind of external force, but was coming from within. And that, to me, is what made Euromaidan so powerful, is that it was a movement of the street, essentially, and the people who live and work and breathe and sleep and eat an everyday existence.
This book begins actually by photos of the Euromaidan, and some of the pictures in this book are showing grim situations. But the aesthetic point of view make them more, in sort of way, acceptable. Why is art important to convey a strong message, and is there a risk to objectify the subject and turning the horror into aesthetic subject?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the danger with photojournalism, is when it skews towards an aesthetic image, we lose the power to communicate something. And what intrigued me with the RAW project was not just this project, but the initial project as well, was soliciting images from civilians, from soldiers themselves, and their own sort of social media profiles to discuss the war. So in tandem, you have a complete sort of photographic document of the civilians, the soldiers, and the journalists, who are all sort of tightly intertwined in this conflict.
So you won the World Press Photo Award for your work called Interrogations, showing the backstage of Ukrainian interrogation rooms. There are situations of extreme tensions. As a photojournalist, what is the better way to photograph violence?
Well, I think I have a lot of problems with journalistic violence. The sort of inherent violence in an image of a man with a gun can be incredibly powerful, and we do need to see that. But I think what's even more powerful is the implications of violence. And again, it goes back to the idea of consequences. Because a man firing a gun is immediate, but the effects of that man firing the gun somewhere into another body are everlasting. And that, to me, is the much more profound and powerful stake that photojournalism should and could have, is in the sort of after effects of these consequences. And that's what I was aiming to do with Interrogations, was to show consequences, was to show an implied violence that is within an entire system. And as we know, Ukraine has struggles with corruption and with abuses of power, but it's infused into the entire system. And that, to me, is where the real story lies.
And which project are you working on right now, if you can tell us about it?
Not a Ukrainian project. It's the first non-Ukrainian work I've done in about 12 years. It's a project about D-Day, about the Allied landings in Normandy, France, and the liberation of Europe by the Canadian, American, and British perspective. Actually, sorry, let me correct that. Let me say it's the liberation of Western Europe by the Allies.
Okay. And one last question. Which advice would you give to a young photojournalist or journalist who begins that kind of career into war or into journalism today?
To look past your lens. Photographers have, by nature, we look like this, and we look straight forward, but we don't look to our left and we don't look to our right. And I think we have to sort of see photography in its peripheral, in its context, and to really understand the absolute power that a photograph can have if provided the appropriate context, and to help deliver and to show all of this sort of knowledges that you see when you're photographing.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Weber. It was a great pleasure to have you on the show. This was Mr. Weber talking about photography in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. You're on UATV. Stay tuned for the rest of the program.